Welcome back to another explainer, folks. Today, we are diving headfirst into one of the most volatile and high-stakes geopolitical realignments happening in the world right now. We're talking about Myanmar. But listen, this isn't just about Myanmar's internal civil war following the 2021 military coup. It's actually about how that total institutional collapse is triggering a massive multi-billion-dollar infrastructure race between two absolute heavyweights, China and India. Both superpowers are desperately trying to secure strategic corridors through a country where the central government has basically lost its monopoly on violence. So why should you care? Because whoever wins this race is going to fundamentally alter global supply chains, international trade routes, and the entire balance of power that dictates our global economy. It's a fascinating, deeply chaotic chessboard, and we're going to map the whole thing out for you. To keep things organized, here is our roadmap. We're starting with the Malacca Dilemma, then China's billion-dollar master plan, followed by the reality of a fractured sovereign state, India's Act East dilemma, the seismic and systemic risks, and we'll wrap up with a new balance of power. Section 1. The Malacca Dilemma, the geographic vulnerability. Okay, so to understand the solution, you really have to understand the vulnerability first. For decades now, the core anxiety keeping Chinese maritime strategists up at night has been the Malacca Dilemma. Basically, the vast majority of China's energy imports from the Middle East, as well as its massive exports to Europe and South Asia, absolutely must squeeze through the Strait of Malacca. It's a natural maritime choke point. In any kind of major geopolitical crisis, adversarial naval forces could easily blockade this narrow strait, and if that happens, it would effectively starve the Chinese economy of hydrocarbons. We're talking about an existential vulnerability here. Which brings us to the million-dollar question. Really, the multi-billion-dollar question. How exactly does a superpower bypass its greatest maritime vulnerability? I mean, you can't move the ocean, and you certainly can't move the strait. The answer? You build an overland shortcut. You turn a neighboring country, in this case Myanmar, into a transcontinental land bridge that directly connects landlocked southwestern China right to the Indian Ocean. Section 2. China's billion-dollar master plan, the CMEC strategy. The sheer scale and the upfront capital commitment of this master plan are absolutely staggering. It's called the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. This whole network links directly to internally funded routes deep inside China, specifically from Baoshan to Roli. But the real crown jewel is a proposed high-speed railway linking Muse to Mandalay and then all the way down to Kyaukphyu. Phase 1 alone requires an $8.9 billion investment for just 431 kilometers of track. You might be wondering, why on earth is it so expensive? Well, it requires building 124 bridges and boring 60 tunnels straight through mountainous terrain. And for Phase 2, the junta leader Min Aung Hlaing personally pushed for the route to pass right through Bagan, which is Myanmar's premier UNESCO World Heritage archaeological site, just to artificially boost tourism. And get this, despite the raging civil war, China actually pushed to get construction machinery moving again in May 2026. So where does this incredibly expensive railway actually end? Right at the $1.3 billion Kyaukphyu deep sea port. And the ownership structure here reveals a massive, glaring asymmetry. A dominant 70% majority stake belongs to the Chinese CITIC consortium. The Myanmar government, they hold just 30%. This asymmetry is absolutely crucial to understand. Once it's fully operational, this port isn't just going to handle cargo containers and massive oil tankers. It has what we call latent dual-use capabilities. That means it could very easily offer the Chinese Navy a logistical footprint right smack in the Bay of Bengal. Section 3. A fractured sovereign state, the rise of EAOs. Now, here is where the plot really twists. Following a massive, highly coordinated rebel offensive known as Operation 1027, the Central Military Junta, the SAC, has essentially been reduced to a subcontractor state. They don't run the show anymore. The actual keys to these multi-billion-dollar construction sites are held by heavily armed ethnic armed organizations, or EAOs. Groups like the MDAA and the TNLA now control the critical northern trade routes in Shan State, and they've actually been getting into intense skirmishes with each other over that territory recently. Meanwhile, you've got the Iraqi army, and they physically dominate the territory completely surrounding that Chinese deep sea port we just talked about. On top of all that, the shadow NUG government is exerting immense political pressure regarding these foreign investments. The junta can sit in the capital signing sovereign debt agreements all day long, but they simply no longer exert physical control over the dirt where these projects actually need to be built. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates China's totally ruthless diplomatic pragmatism. On one hand, you have their traditional state-to-state diplomacy. Beijing rolls out the literal red carpet for junta leader Min Aung Hlaing, they smile for the official photos, and they sign the high-level paperwork. But simultaneously, behind the scenes, they are executing state-to-rebel diplomacy. Chinese intelligence and military officials are quietly holding direct, private security negotiations in places like Lashio with the MNDA and the Iraqi army. Beijing knows perfectly well the junta can't protect these assets, so they are proactively building a shadow security architecture directly with the rebels in the jungle. Section 4. India's Act East Dilemma, the stalled alternative. Watching all of this unfold with growing alarm is India. New Delhi has its own desperate need for a land bridge through Myanmar as part of its Act East policy. India initiated the Caledon project specifically to bypass its own geographic bottleneck and link its landlocked northeastern states to the sea. But man, the timeline of India's Caledon project is just a masterclass in chronic delays. It was initiated way back in 2008. They missed their original completion date in 2014. They missed a heavily revised target in December 2023. And as of mid-2026, the final, incredibly critical 109-kilometer highway connecting Myanmar's Chin state to the Indian border is completely 100% stalled by armed conflict. India has massively struggled to match China's aggressive, well-funded momentum here. All of this failure has forced India into a really painful strategic adaptation. Step 1. Just like China, India initially played the orthodox, state-centric game. They hosted the gentle leader for a red carpet visit in May 2026, hoping to secure hard border guarantees. Step 2. Those guarantees proved completely hollow, mainly because the junta was actively losing the very states where India's projects were located. So that brings us to step 3. India is reluctantly learning the exact same lesson China did. The local government in India's bordering Mizoram state has quietly pivoted to establishing cooperative relationships directly with the rebel Iraqi army just to try and salvage whatever is left of their investments.
Section 5. Seismic and systemic risks, earthquakes, and crime.
So, the crucial point we really have to add to this already chaotic political chessboard is the extreme physical wildcard threatening absolutely everything: 4,355. That staggering number represents the confirmed fatalities from the devastating March 28, 2025 earthquake that struck near Mandalay. And guess where Mandalay is? Right smack on the proposed route for China's massive high-speed railway. This builds into an almost unthinkable engineering risk. A detailed study out of UCLA showed that a 530-kilometer stretch of the Ceding fault experienced a very rare, incredibly violent super shear rupture. We are talking about a magnitude 7.8 quake moving at 5 kilometers per second. It generated destructive subterranean Mach waves, which is essentially a literal sonic boom inside the rock. It caused nearly 8 meters of physical displacement. That is more than enough to completely shear steel oil pipelines and instantly buckle railways. The absolute absurdity of attempting to build an $8.9 billion infrastructure network directly on top of this hyperactive fault line introduces a level of financial and humanitarian risk that is just mind-boggling. And incredibly, it doesn't stop with the railway. Beijing is relentlessly pushing the junta to revive the deeply toxic $3.6 billion Myitsone megadam on the Irrawaddy River, which happens to be right near the same seismic zone. This project is opposed by an estimated 85% of the Myanmar population, as well as the opposition NUG government. They view it as an outright ecological disaster that only serves to siphon cheap electricity back to China while funding the junta's military machine. For Beijing, forcing the junta to accept this universally despised project is basically the ultimate litmus test of their absolute subservience. On top of all the environmental and seismic risks, we have the criminal element. The total breakdown of state authority allowed massive cyber scam centers to proliferate right on the border, mostly protected by junta-aligned militias. This got so bad, it actually became a domestic security issue for China. In response, defense analysts widely agree that Beijing tacitly enabled the massive rebel offensive, Operation 1027, specifically to pressure the junta and aggressively dismantle these illicit scam hubs to arrest Chinese nationals. This proves a vital, undeniable point. Beijing is entirely willing to actively destabilize the central regime and empower armed rebels if its own secondary national security interests are threatened. And finally, Section 6, a new balance of power, the Indo-Pacific future. So, what happens if these balkanized megaprojects are actually completed amidst all this physical and political chaos? Well, first off, it's going to be incredibly violent. Local resistance groups have issued a very stark warning.
They have explicitly stated they are, quote, not worried about upsetting Beijing, and they threaten to launch devastating attacks on any sovereign infrastructure simply to deny the military regime any revenue or perceived legitimacy. Sovereign guarantees issued in the safety of the capital carry absolutely no weight on the ground.
But if China does manage to somehow navigate this balkanized landscape, bribe or subdue the local militias, and engineer their way around massive earthquakes, we are left with a profound reality. If China successfully bypasses the Malacca Strait and secures its dual-use deep-sea port in the Bay of Bengal, while India's connectivity projects remain physically severed by conflict, how drastically will the naval calculus of the entire Indian Ocean change? It's a question that completely redefines the 21st century balance of power, and the answer is being written right now in the fractured jungles of Myanmar. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, folks. Keep asking the big questions, and I'll see you next time.